November 1942, off Guadalcanal. In the dead of night, the sky suddenly lit up like daylight. Japanese officers stood frozen as American warships poured out more shells in 30 seconds than Japan could supply for an entire campaign. They thought it was waste, but the brutal truth soon became clear. Behind those guns stood an industrial giant. And this story reveals why Japan realized it had already lost from the very first day. November 13th, 1942, 0148 hours. Iron Bottom, Sound, off the coast of Guadalcanal. The sea was black and heavy, the kind of night where even veterans felt the weight of the dark pressing down on their shoulders. On the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze, Captain Hara gripped the rail so tightly his knuckles turned white. His men waited in silence, straining their ears for the sounds of approaching American ships. And then it happened. A searchlight beam sliced through the tropical darkness. For one breathless second, it illuminated the waves. The next second, the night erupted. Shells screamed through the air. Explosions tore open the sea in blinding flashes. The horizon disappeared in a wall of fire. To Hara's eyes, it was as if a volcano had erupted on the surface of the ocean. He reached for his logbook and scrawled in haste. They are not aiming. They are simply filling the sky with steel. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained its gunners to count every round, to conserve ammunition like it was blood itself. But here, tonight, Captain Hara watched American ships fire as if the supply was infinite. The heavy cruiser USS San Francisco unleashed more 5-inch shells in 35 seconds than some Japanese destroyers carried for their entire mission. Barrels glowed red from the heat of constant fire. The ocean, once a place of shadows, was now lit like artificial daylight. Hara's men were stunned. This wasn't careful, measured fire. It was a storm, a rolling thunder of steel and flame that drowned out thought itself. 2,700 miles away, in Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already being loaded. 15,000 tons of shells, enough to replace everything the U.S. fleet would expend in this battle 50 times over. But Hara didn't know that yet. All he knew was what he saw. Americans firing with a kind of reckless abandon that made no sense in the world he understood. To the Japanese, every shell was precious. To the Americans, it seemed like ammunition grew on trees. On that night in Iron Bottom Sound, Hara realized he was staring not just at the enemy, but at something far more dangerous. A system that could afford to waste what his nation could not even dream of supplying. The men of the Amatsukaze fought on, but in Hara's heart, a seed of doubt had been planted. It was the beginning of a revelation that would haunt him for the rest of the war. For Captain Hara and every officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, ammunition was not just a supply item, it was lifeblood. Every shell had to be accounted for, every bullet rationed as if the empire itself depended on it. Because it did. On Japanese ships, gunners were drilled with strict rules. Hold fire until the target was within 800 meters. Fire only in short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds at most. Cease fire the moment the aircraft or ship passed out of optimal range, not because it was the smartest tactical choice, but because the magazines could not support anything else. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, serving aboard the carrier Ryujo, knew these rules by heart. He had trained his gunners relentlessly, and still every man on his crew carried a private fear that the roar of their guns would one day be silenced, not by enemy fire, but by the hollow, dreadful click of an empty chamber. The numbers were grim. A Japanese carrier's anti-aircraft magazines held enough ammunition for just 12 minutes of sustained fire. After that, they were defenseless. 12 minutes, the life of a ship measured in a quarter of an hour. One Japanese officer would later confess to American interrogators, We trained not to fight with our guns, but to stretch the time until we had no more shells. It was a cruel arithmetic. Every commander had to gamble. Fire too soon, and you risked being helpless when the real attack arrived. Fire too late, and the enemy might already be upon you. For the sailors, it was a constant burden. Imagine a 19-year-old gunner, sweat pouring down his back in the Pacific heat, gripping the handles of his 25mm anti-aircraft gun. Overhead, American dive bombers approached in formation. He wanted to fire, to unleash everything in his magazine. But the order hadn't come. He had to wait, count the seconds, count the meters, count every round. In those tense moments, the Japanese Navy wasn't just fighting the Americans. They were fighting time itself. Meanwhile, the Americans had adopted a very different doctrine, one that seemed reckless, even absurd to Japanese eyes. They didn't count rounds. They didn't hold back. Their strategy was to fire continuously, to create a wall of steel that no aircraft could penetrate. But Hara and his fellow officers wouldn't fully understand that reality until later. For now, all they knew was the feeling in their gut, the gnawing anxiety that every battle carried the same risk, that the magazines would run dry before the enemy was defeated. That fear haunted Japanese sailors far more than they ever admitted, and as the war dragged on, it would prove deadly. While Japanese gunners counted every round like drops of gold, American sailors lived in another world entirely, on US. Warships, the problem wasn't how to conserve ammunition, it was how to keep up with the supply pouring into their gun mounts. Aboard the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, seaman. First Class William Porter remembered the shock of his first night action off Guadalcanal. He was only 20 years old, his hands blistered from loading shell after shell into the glowing barrel of a 5-inch gun. The barrel looked like a stovepipe on fire, he later told his grandson. We just kept feeding it. They told us, keep firing until the order comes to stop. And that order never came. Shell casings clanged across the deck, piling up ankle deep, still too hot to touch. The smell of burnt powder and scorched steel choked the air, but the gunners hardly noticed. Their arms moved automatically, a rhythm of endless supply. It wasn't elegant shooting. They weren't calculating the perfect moment or the most efficient burst. They were building a wall of fire, a moving curtain of steel that made the night sky itself a weapon. On a Japanese ship, a gunnery officer might spend hours rehearsing when to give the order to fire. On an American ship, the men didn't have time to think. Ammunition handlers ran back and forth, sweat pouring down their faces, hauling fresh shells from deep magazines that seemed bottomless. And when the battle was over, something remarkable happened. Where Japanese officers would gather their men and calculate what percentage of ammunition had been used, whether they had enough for the next fight, American crews often had a very different complaint. Why did we have to lug so much extra ammo back down into the magazines? For the Americans, the burden was not scarcity, but abundance. Porter recalled how, during one lull, a shipmate muttered, "Feels like we're wasting it." The chief petty officer barked back, "Son, Uncle Sam's got plenty more where that came from." You just keep loading. That phrase, "plenty more where that came from," wasn't just talk. It was truth. Even as the barrels glowed red in Iron Bottom Sound, across the Pacific at Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already being loaded with tens of thousands of fresh shells. Entire convoys of Liberty ships carried cargoes of powder and steel, ready to replace in weeks what Japanese factories couldn't produce in a year. To the Japanese, it looked insane, wasteful, impossible. To the Americans, it was just another night's work. And that difference, the fear of running out versus the confidence of never running dry, would prove more decisive than any admiral's strategy or any general's plan. It was the mathematics of war, written not in tactics, but in steel casings and smokeless powder. Far from the roar of the Pacific, in the quiet farmland of Nebraska, another battle was being fought. It didn't involve ships or aircraft, but it was every bit as decisive. The Naval Ammunition Depot at Hastings stretched across 48,000 acres of prairie, larger than many American cities. From the air, it looked like an endless grid of low, flat buildings, rail spurs, and storage bunkers, a silent city devoted entirely to one thing: feeding the guns of the U.S. Navy. At dawn, the whistle blew and the prairie came alive. 10,000 workers streamed through the gates, most of them women and young men barely out of high school. One of them was Mary Thompson. 19 years old, she'd grown up on a Nebraska farm, milking cows before school and listening to swing music on the family's radio. Now she tied back her hair with a red kerchief, pulled on denim overalls, and stepped into a world that smelled of cordite and machine oil. Her job was simple: assemble and inspect 5-inch shells, the same kind that Seaman William Porter had fed into his guns at Guadalcanal. She remembered the rhythm of it: pick up the shell, check the casing for flaws, wipe it clean, pack it into a crate, move it down the line, 100 times an hour, 1,000 times a day. And all the while, music played over the loudspeakers: Glenn Miller, Bing Crosby, the Andrews Sisters, reminding everyone why they were there. Mary often joked to her friends, "I may not be in the Navy, but every box I pack is headed for the front." She was right. The numbers were staggering. In its first month, the Hastings Depot produced more naval ammunition than the entire Japanese Empire could produce in a year. By 1943, the plant was turning out 300,000 rounds per month, more than the entire Japanese fleet would fire in some campaigns. Mary never saw a battlefield. She never met Captain Hara or the men who feared running out of shells. But in a very real sense, she was there with them. Every crate she packed, every round she inspected, was another link in the chain that stretched from the Nebraska prairie to the decks of American warships half a world away. For the Japanese, scarcity was a constant shadow. For Mary and her co-workers, abundance was the daily routine. And that contrast, the calm, methodical work of a teenager in Nebraska versus the desperate rationing of a veteran captain in the Pacific, spoke louder than any speech or propaganda. America wasn't just fighting with soldiers, it was fighting with factories, farms, and families. And in the end, that fight would prove decisive. For Captain Hara, the sight of American ships firing without pause felt like madness. For Mary Thompson in Nebraska, it was just another day's work. But behind both of these stories lay something bigger than any individual: the arithmetic of war. The numbers alone were enough to crush an empire. At Hastings, Nebraska, a single ammunition depot produced 100,000 5-inch rounds per month in its early days, climbing to 300,000 rounds monthly by late 1943. That was one facility, one dot on the map. Japan's premier arsenal at Kure, by comparison, struggled to manufacture 10,000 shells of all calibers in a month. 10,000. That wasn't enough to supply a single sustained battle. To put it plainly, what one American plant could make in a week, the entire Japanese empire struggled to produce in a month. The gap only widened when you looked at manpower. Japan, short on adult workers, conscripted school children as young as 12 into dangerous shifts at Toyokawa Arsenal. They worked long hours under dim lights, packing powder and machining shell casings with trembling hands. Meanwhile, in America, factory lines were humming with machinery that did the heavy lifting. Teenagers like Mary wore clean coveralls, listened to the radio, and worked 8-hour shifts with breaks for lunch. It wasn't easy work, but it wasn't desperation. Even quality control told the same story. At Hastings, inspectors rejected more defective rounds each month than Japan managed to produce in total. Imagine that. A mountain of rejects in Nebraska that exceeded the entire usable output of Tokyo's best arsenal, and shells were only the beginning. In 1943, the U.S. produced 350,000 rounds of 5-inch naval ammunition every single month. In that same year, Japan's combined arsenals struggled to supply its fleet with enough ammunition for even a handful of major operations. It was as if two nations were playing different games entirely. One fought with what it had left in the warehouse, the other fought with what it could produce tomorrow, next week, next month, without fear of running dry. Hara could sense this imbalance in his gut that night at Iron Bottom Sound, even if he couldn't yet calculate it. And men like Mary, standing in the heart of America, were the reason why. This wasn't just war fought with ships and sailors. It was war fought with statistics, relentless, merciless numbers that spelled out Japan's defeat before many of its admirals even realized it. And soon, those numbers would reveal themselves on the battlefield in ways no Japanese commander could ignore. August 9th, 1942. The Battle of Savo Island. It was supposed to be a triumph for the Imperial Japanese Navy. In a night action that stunned the Allies, Japanese cruisers slipped through the dark waters off Guadalcanal and tore into an Allied task force with lethal precision. In less than an hour, they sank 4 heavy cruisers, USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra. Hundreds of Allied sailors were lost. For Captain Hara and his countrymen, it was the kind of blow they had dreamed of delivering since Pearl Harbor. Reports flashed back to Tokyo, and the High Command celebrated. Newspapers hailed it as proof of Japan's naval superiority. But inside the ships that fired those victorious salvos, the mood was different. Aboard the cruiser Chokai, gunnery officers gathered after the battle and looked at their shell inventories. The numbers were sobering. The magazines were nearly empty. Anti-aircraft ammunition had been bled dry. Torpedoes had been spent. One Japanese officer admitted privately, "We could not fight another battle that night. We had won, and yet we had nothing left to fight with." Even more shocking, the Japanese commander, Admiral Mikawa, made the agonizing decision to withdraw before attacking the American transport ships anchored nearby. Those transports were the true prize, the lifeline bringing Marines, food, fuel, and ammunition onto Guadalcanal. Destroying them could have doomed the U.S.-owned foothold on the island, but Mikawa turned away. He had to. His ships had spent their ammunition. They had no choice. Back in Tokyo, the victory was celebrated as a triumph, but for the men who had been there, it was hollow. They had seen the truth. Firepower meant nothing if it couldn't be sustained. Meanwhile, even as Japanese cruisers limped home, American logistics were already moving. In Pearl Harbor, a resupply ship was being loaded with 15,000 tons of shells, 50 times the amount the Japanese had just used in their triumph. Within weeks, the U.S. fleet was back, magazines full, guns ready. Captain Hara would later reflect bitterly, "Our victories felt like sand in the hand. We could grasp them, but they slipped away because we had no ammunition left to hold them." For the men of the Japanese Navy, Savo Island was a lesson written in fire. Even a battlefield victory could taste like defeat if your magazines were empty. And that bitter reality would only grow sharper as the war dragged on. While Japanese sailors on the front lines feared the moment their magazines would run dry, American workers thousands of miles away were living a very different war. At Norfolk, Virginia, ammunition ships lined the docks, Liberty ships and Victory ships, each one packed with steel crates stacked 3 stories high. To the dock workers, it was just another day's labor. To Japanese eyes, had they seen it, it would have looked like an endless mountain of firepower. James O'Leary, a longshoreman from New Jersey, remembered those days clearly. "We were loading shells by the ton. Forklifts and cranes ran around the clock. And when you got thirsty, you just cracked open a Coca-Cola and kept on working." It wasn't just Coke. Workers at Hastings and other depots often had candy bars tucked into their lunch pails or smoked Lucky Strikes during breaks, leaning against crates of ammunition bound for the Pacific. The irony was striking, casual comfort side by side with instruments of destruction. One American sailor recalled escorting a convoy and seeing Liberty ships packed with ammunition. It looked like they were carrying the whole state of Nebraska across the ocean. For the Japanese, the contrast was almost unbearable. When prisoners of war later arrived in the United States, They were stunned by what they saw. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, captured in 1944, described his shock in a diary smuggled home after the war. "They showed us the warehouses in Norfolk, ammunition piled higher than any building in my town. I realized then we had lost the war before it even began." In Japan, civilians collected scrap metal from household pots and pans to melt down into bullets. Children brought coins to schools for war drives. Women patched uniforms until they were threadbare. Every resource had to be squeezed. In America, abundance spilled into every corner. Workers tossed half-empty bottles of soda. Cigarettes were stubbed out with half their length remaining. Even the waste, Coca-Cola bottles, candy wrappers, discarded cigarettes, spoke to a level of wealth the Japanese could not imagine. And through it all, the flow of ammunition never stopped. The factories produced, the trains carried, the ships delivered. From the heartland to the harbors, America's war machine was fueled not only by industry, but by a way of life that assumed there would always be more tomorrow. For Japanese sailors like Captain Hara, rationing shells was a daily burden. For Americans, the real burden was hauling all that abundance to the front. The difference was not just in firepower. It was in the very fabric of two societies, one defined by scarcity, the other by plenty. And as the war ground on, that difference would become impossible to ignore. February 27, 1942, the Battle of the Java Sea. Japanese cruisers and destroyers moved swiftly through the waters off Indonesia, hunting an Allied fleet made up of American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships. On paper, the Japanese held the advantage. Their gunners were skilled, their torpedoes deadly, and their officers experienced. But when the shooting started, something caught the Japanese off guard. The Americans didn't stop firing. Captain Hara remembered the moment vividly. From his position, he watched Allied guns belch flame and smoke with a fury that seemed almost senseless. Salvo after salvo roared across the waves. Many shells splashed wide, exploding harmlessly in the sea. But the sheer volume was overwhelming. One Japanese officer muttered, "They shoot as though the sea were endless, as though every splash were free." And in a way it was. For the Japanese, every round fired was a decision. Was this worth the cost? Could they afford it? For the Americans, the calculation was different. Ammunition wasn't precious. It was plentiful. The order was simple. Keep firing, keep the guns hot, keep the enemy under pressure. The effect was psychological as much as physical. Japanese crews began to feel as though they were under siege not just by ships, but by industry itself. Factories thousands of miles away that gave the Americans the luxury of waste. One petty officer aboard the destroyer Asagumo later confessed in an interview, "It was not their aim that frightened us. It was that the fire never stopped. We thought, if this battle lasts 2 more hours, we will be empty, and they will still be shooting." That thought alone was enough to shake morale. Tactically, Japan still fought well in the Java Sea. Their famed long-lance torpedoes struck true, and Allied losses were heavy. But the Japanese sailors knew the truth as they looked at their dwindling ammunition stores. Victory on the battlefield meant little if they couldn't reload for the next fight. Meanwhile, the Americans had already calculated resupply. Ammunition convoys were steaming across the Pacific, their holds stuffed with crates stamped "Made in Nebraska," packed in Oklahoma, inspected in Pennsylvania. Factories Mary Thompson would recognize had supplied those shells. The Japanese might win today, but what about tomorrow, and the day after that? For Hara, the sight of Americans firing without fear of running out was a reminder that Japan was not just fighting a navy. It was fighting a nation that had turned its entire way of life into a machine for war. And no matter how skilled the sailors, that machine was relentless. It began in a quiet town on the Nebraska prairie. Mary Thompson lifted a 5-inch shell casing onto the conveyor belt. She checked the metal for flaws, wiped it down, and slid it forward. To her, it was just one of thousands she handled that week. But that single shell was about to embark on a journey that spanned a continent and an ocean. From the assembly line, it was packed into a wooden crate, 6 shells to a box, each one stenciled with U.S. Navy, Hastings Depot. Forklifts carried the boxes onto flatbed rail cars lined up on sidings that stretched farther than the eye could see. The trains rumbled eastward across the Great Plains, through Iowa and Illinois, into Pennsylvania. Along the way, thousands of other shipments joined them. Powder from DuPont factories, fuses from New Jersey, primers from Massachusetts, all of it converged on America's great ports. At Norfolk, Virginia, the crates were unloaded and stacked into Liberty ships. Dock cranes swung back and forth, lowering pallet after pallet into cavernous holds. One ship alone could carry more ammunition than the entire Japanese Navy could produce in half a year. And then the convoy sailed. Across the Atlantic, around the Panama Canal, or westward across the Pacific, guarded by destroyers and patrol aircraft. Every crate represented Mary's work, multiplied by millions of others across the nation. Weeks later, in the steaming waters off Guadalcanal, that same shell was hauled up from deep within a magazine of the USS San Francisco. Sailors wrestled it into the breech of a 5-inch gun, slammed the chamber shut, and waited for the order. Commence firing. The shell that began as a piece of metal on Mary's workbench roared out of the barrel at 2,000 feet per second, streaking into the night sky where Captain Hara and his men watched in shock as American firepower lit the heavens. To Hara, it was a mystery. How could the Americans shoot so much? To Mary, it was simple. She did her part, and so did millions of others. That was the genius of the American system. It didn't rely on a single arsenal or one heroic effort. It was a chain: farmers, machinists, train conductors, dock workers, sailors, each link connected, each one turning raw steel and powder into victory on the other side of the world. And that chain was endless. For every shell fired, another was already on its way. Japan's sailors fought bravely, but they were trapped in a war where every trigger pull brought them closer to an empty magazine. America's sailors fought knowing that no matter how many rounds they fired, there would always be more waiting in the hold, and more still on the way. It was not just a battle of ships, it was a battle of supply lines, and in that battle, America could not lose. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The morning sun rose over a vast armada. Hundreds of American carriers, battleships, and cruisers stretched across the horizon, their decks bristling with aircraft and guns. The Japanese combined fleet had come to break America's advance toward the Marianas. For Tokyo, it was a do-or-die gamble. For the men in the cockpits of Japanese Zeros and bombers, it began like so many battles before. Engines roared to life, wings lifted off carrier decks, and formations climbed into the bright Pacific sky. Their orders were simple: break through, destroy the carriers, and stop the American tide. But what awaited them was unlike anything they had ever faced. As the first waves approached the American fleet, the sky itself seemed to erupt. From every carrier, every battleship, every cruiser, a storm of gunfire rose into the air. The American tactic was brutally simple. Don't aim at one plane, fill the heavens with lead. Tracer rounds arced upward in glowing red and white streams. Explosions dotted the sky. It looked, one pilot said later, as though the ocean itself was throwing fire into the air. Captain Hara, who survived the battle, would later write, "It was not air combat, it was suicide. We flew into a wall of steel." The statistics were staggering. American ships and aircraft fired 1.9 million rounds of ammunition in a single day. Nearly 500,000 of those rounds were 20mm and 40mm shells from anti-aircraft guns, creating an impenetrable storm. By nightfall, the Japanese had lost 476 aircraft. The Americans lost just 29. One Japanese pilot who managed to ditch at sea and survive capture recalled the shock of that day. "We were told the Americans wasted their ammunition, that they fired wildly, without discipline. But when I saw the sky burning with their shells, I understood. They had more ammunition than we could ever dream of." It wasn't just numbers, it was a revelation. The Japanese Navy had gambled everything on the ability of its air wings to punch through. Instead, their planes were slaughtered before they even reached the American carriers. And while Japanese magazines ran dry, America's ships still had mountains of ammunition in reserve. Convoys of Liberty ships were already steaming westward, holds packed with fresh crates of shells. The Japanese called it the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Americans gave it a different name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Japanese, it was more than a defeat. It was the day they realized the truth Captain Hara had glimpsed back in 1942. This wasn't just a fight between navies, it was a fight between entire nations. One nation rationed every bullet. The other nation fired until the barrels glowed red, and still had plenty more. From that day forward, the skies of the Pacific belonged to America. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Captain Hara was one of the few senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy who lived to tell the tale. He had survived Guadalcanal, the Java Sea, the Philippine Sea, and the long retreat across the Pacific. But survival carried its own burden. In the quiet years after Japan's surrender, Hara began writing his memoirs. The words came slowly, as if each sentence forced him to relive the shock of those battles. Again and again he returned to the same haunting memory. The first time he saw American ships fire as though ammunition were limitless. He admitted with startling honesty, "They fired more in minutes than we carried for entire missions. At first I thought it wasteful. Later I understood it was power. Power not of the gunner, but of the nation behind him." Hara realized what many of his countrymen could not admit. Japan had not been defeated by lack of courage or skill. Japanese sailors had fought bravely and often brilliantly, but they had been sent into battle already doomed by arithmetic. "We were brave," he wrote, "but bravery could not stop the factories of Detroit or the endless trains of America." Each round they fired was proof that we had lost before we began. He told students after the war that the lesson of his life was not about naval tactics or the heroism of individual sailors. It was about the system that supported them. The Americans, he said, fought with the strength of their entire society. Farmers, machinists, women in factories, children collecting scrap, all of it became firepower. In one of his most quoted reflections, Hara confessed to his audience, "We thought war was decided by ships and men, but it was decided by those we could not see. The workers in the factories, the hands that packed the shells, the nation that never ran dry." For the young cadets listening, it was a sobering lesson. For Hara, it was a kind of confession. He had lived through the nightmare of scarcity, watched his men die with empty magazines, and seen the enemy fight with an abundance that seemed like madness, until he realized it was genius. The captain who once shook his head in disbelief at America's wasteful fire had finally understood. It was not waste. It was victory, forged in steel and sweat half a world away. The Pacific War was not only fought on stormy seas and jungle islands. It was fought in factories, on farms, in shipyards, and on assembly lines. Captain Hara had lived through the fire and smoke. He had watched American guns roar without pause, had seen skies filled with steel, and had carried home the bitter knowledge that courage alone could not match abundance. Looking back, he confessed that Japan had never truly understood what it was up against. His nation believed wars were won by bravery, discipline, and sacrifice. But in reality, wars in the modern age were won by systems, by societies that could turn everyday life into war-making power. In Japan, children collected scrap metal, families rationed rice, and soldiers prayed for enough shells to last through the next attack. In America, workers ate candy bars, smoked cigarettes, and drank Coca-Cola while stacking crates of ammunition higher than the rooftops of Norfolk warehouses. That difference was not just about firepower. It was about the way each nation organized itself. Japan relied on scarcity and sacrifice, pushing its people to endure hardship without end. America relied on abundance, on innovation, and on the belief that free citizens working together could outproduce any enemy. The result was clear. By 1944, American factories were building more planes in a single year than Japan built in the entire war. Ammunition flowed from Nebraska, Pennsylvania, and Oklahoma in quantities so vast that sailors joked about being buried in it. And on the decks of U.S. oil carriers, gunners fired with confidence because they knew there would always be more. For Japanese veterans who later spoke of the war, the memory of that imbalance never faded. One sailor said quietly after returning home, "When I saw how they fired without counting, I knew I had fought in vain. It was a lesson that reached far beyond the Pacific." America's victory was not simply the triumph of one navy over another. It was the triumph of a society that harnessed its democracy, its industry, and its creativity. Every farmer who grew wheat, every worker who riveted steel, every young woman like Mary Thompson who packed shells in Nebraska, they all stood on the front lines, even if they never wore a uniform. In the end, that was the true secret of the wall of fire that stunned Captain Hara in 1942. It wasn't reckless waste. It was the visible expression of a nation's strength, drawn from millions of ordinary lives working toward one purpose. And that is why, more than 70 years later, the story of those shells and the people who made them still deserves to be remembered. So if you believe stories like this should not be forgotten, take a moment to like and subscribe, because history is more than battles. It's about the people who made victory possible. History isn't just about battles and dates. It's about the people, the choices, and the moments that changed everything. What do you think about Captain Hara's realization? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. That way, you won't miss the next untold chapter of World War II we'll share together.